A poor boy, determined to care for his paraplegic father, is forced to sell lemonade on the street to support them both. But one day, he comes home to find this. John was only 14 years old, carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for his age. Life had never been easy, but it became even harder after the car accident that took his mother's life and left his father, David, paralyzed. Even before the accident, David had never been a very present or affectionate father. He was reserved and distant, but after the tragedy, this distance grew even more. Now, confined to a wheelchair, he hardly ever spoke to John and seemed oblivious to what was happening around him. The household was supported only by the government benefits David received, and the money barely covered the basics. Despite his father's indifference and lack of emotional support, John felt a responsibility greater than he could understand. He knew he needed to do something to help. That's when Richard, the neighbor always ready to offer words of encouragement, suggested that John set up a small wooden stand and use the lemons from his backyard to sell lemonade on the street. For John, it was more than just an idea. He saw it as a real opportunity to improve his life and his father's, and he embraced the suggestion with enthusiasm and a desire to make a difference. The day began early for John, as usual. He would get up, quickly dress in simple clothes, and then head to the kitchen, where he prepared and drank a simple coffee. After finishing his coffee, John would get up and start organizing everything he needed for the day. He grabbed the old bucket and the small knife he used to cut the lemons, wrapped a cloth around his shoulders to wipe off the sweat later, and checked if he had saved enough change for the customers. Ready, he would go to the room where his father spent most of his time. David would be sitting in his wheelchair staring blankly at the off television. "Good morning, Dad," John said cheerfully, trying to fill the emptiness that lingered in the house. David replied without taking his eyes off the screen. It was almost an automatic response, devoid of emotion. John sighed lightly, already used to his father's coldness, but still a little disappointed. "I'm going to work at the stand today." "See you later," he said, hoping for some sign of interest, but David remained motionless, not even turning his head. John gave up and left the house, carefully closing the door. Walking to Richard's house, John observed the streets already beginning to stir with activity. Richard lived just a few houses away. He knocked on the worn wooden door and waited. Soon, Richard appeared, smiling as always. "John, you're up early today, huh?" Richard said, opening the door and stepping aside to let the boy in. "Good morning, Mr. Richard. I came to get some lemons, if you don't mind," John said, holding the bucket. "Of course not, boy. Go out back. Help yourself to what you need. The crop's good this month," Richard said, smiling warmly. John nodded in thanks and went to the backyard, where the scent of lemon trees filled the air. He began picking the ripe fruit carefully, filling the bucket. After filling the bucket, John thanked him again. "Thanks, Mr. Richard. I'll be off before the sun gets too strong." "Good luck today. If you need more lemons, just stop by," Richard said, waving as John left. John carefully carried the bucket to the busy sidewalk where his small wooden stand was set up. He adjusted the crates he used for support, organized the cups, and got to work. The process was always the same. Cut the lemons, squeeze the juice with his hands, now calloused and rough from daily work, and mix it with water and sugar. His hands ached, but he didn't mind anymore. The important thing was having the product ready for the customers. The sun was strong, and John could feel the heat building on his skin. Still, he smiled at every customer who stopped to buy a cup of lemonade. Business kept going, and John barely had time to rest. The bucket of lemons was quickly emptied, and the lemonade container grew lighter. It was then that he noticed the sky, once blue, beginning to fill with gray clouds. The smell of rain was in the air. Soon after, the first drops started to fall, quickly turning into a heavy downpour. John, without hesitation, began to pack up his things. He closed the bucket, put away the cups, and took down the makeshift stand. Despite the unexpected change, he wasn't discouraged. He had sold almost all the lemonade he had prepared and managed to gather a good amount of coins. John walked back home with light steps, despite the fine rain still lingering in the air. When he got to his front door, he remembered an important detail. David hated noise. Carefully, he turned the doorknob slowly, pushing the door just enough to slip inside. That's when something unexpected made him stop in his tracks. In the living room, lit only by the faint light coming through the window, he saw David standing, rummaging through one of the cabinets. For a moment, John thought he was imagining things. He stood there, frozen, looking in disbelief, a mix of confusion and shock filling him. His hands began to sweat, and the bag swayed slightly as he tried to process what he was seeing. His father, who had said he couldn't walk, was clearly walking without assistance. John stepped back, still unsure of what to do. His heart raced, and he felt a lump form in his throat. Without making a sound, he closed the door again and stepped away. He didn't want to face David at that moment and didn't know how to ask what was going on. He needed answers, but he knew he wouldn't find them there. He then decided to go to Richard's house. John's mind was racing, and he felt the need to talk to someone who could help him understand what he had just witnessed. The rain had stopped, but the air was still damp and cold as he quickly walked, almost running, to his neighbor's house. He knocked loudly, not bothering to hide his nervousness. After a few moments, Richard opened the door with a smile, which quickly faded when he saw John's face. "John, what's wrong? Are you okay? Did something happen?" Richard asked, pulling the boy inside. John entered, still out of breath, and dropped the bucket with the bread bags on the floor beside him. "Mr. Richard, I saw something strange. I don't know what to do." "Calm down, kid. Breathe deeply. Come, sit here," Richard said, guiding him to the small living room sofa. "Now tell me everything. What did you see?" John ran his hands through his wet hair, trying to organize his thoughts. "I got home like always. I opened the door slowly because my dad always complains about the noise, but when I went in, he was standing, Mr. Richard. He was rummaging through a cabinet like nothing had happened." Richard raised his eyebrows, visibly shocked. "Standing? John, are you sure about that?" "Yes, I am. I stood there staring, not believing it. He was walking around the room like he'd never needed that wheelchair. I closed the door and came straight here because I don't know what to think," John said, his voice filled with confusion and disbelief. Richard was silent for a few moments, which only increased John's anxiety. Finally, the neighbor breathed deeply and said, "John, I had some suspicions. I don't know if you've noticed, but your dad's behavior never matched his situation. It always seemed to me that he wasn't being truthful." "But why? Why would he do this?" "Pretending he can't walk? That doesn't make sense," John said, shaking his head, unable to comprehend. Richard looked at the boy with a heavy gaze, as if weighing each word before speaking. "John, this is hard to say, but it could be that he's pretending in order to continue receiving government benefits. It's money that, given his situation, no one would question. And if that's true, well, it's very serious." John felt his stomach churn. The thought that his father could have been lying all along disturbed him even more. "But that's wrong. He can't do this. What if someone finds out? He could get in trouble, couldn't he?" Richard nodded. "More than just trouble, John. This is a crime. It's fraud against the government, and if he gets caught, he could be arrested." "Arrested?" John repeated, now even more worried. I don't want him to go to jail, Mr. Richard. He's my dad. Even with everything, he's the only family I have." Richard sighed, sitting back down beside the boy. The weight of what he needed to say was evident on his face. He put his hand on John's shoulder, speaking calmly but firmly. "John, I understand. And I'm not saying this to hurt you or to make you rush into a decision, but what he's doing is wrong. It's very serious." John lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. But he has no one, just me. What if he goes to jail? Who will take care of him? How will he live? You're already taking care of him, Richard replied in a firmer tone. You're the one working hard every day, selling lemonade in the sun with your hands hurting. Meanwhile, he's sitting at home, pretending a situation that isn't real to keep receiving money he doesn't deserve. This isn't fair, John. Not to you, nor to those who really need that benefit. John looked up at Richard, his expression filled with confusion and sadness. But he's my dad. I just wanted him to be different, to care. Maybe he has his reasons. Maybe he's just scared. Richard leaned forward, getting closer to John. Scared, John? Maybe. But what about you? Aren't you scared? Scared of not being able to support the house on your own? Scared of growing up carrying a weight that shouldn't be yours? You're just a kid, but you're acting like the adult in this house. Meanwhile, he's taking advantage of your strength and the system. That's not something a father should do. John ran his hands over his face, feeling a knot in his throat. But what if he's not pretending? What if I'm wrong? I can't just accuse him like that. I'm not asking you to accuse him without proof, John, Richard said in a softer tone. What I'm saying is, we need to make sure. You saw him walking, right? Now it's time to confirm what's going on. If he's really lying, this needs to stop. Not just for the money, but because he's taking advantage of you. John was silent for a few moments, considering Richard's words. He knew the neighbor was right, but it was hard to accept. The idea of betraying his father, despite everything he had done, felt cruel. Still, the image of David walking through the room wouldn't leave his mind. But what happens after? If I prove this, what happens to him? John asked, his voice low. If he's reported, authorities will investigate. They may ask him to repay the money he improperly received, and depending on what they find, there could be more serious consequences. But John, this isn't your fault. It's a choice he made, Richard said, looking directly into the boy's eyes. And what if he hates me for this? John whispered. Richard smiled faintly, a sad look in his eyes. John, he already doesn't treat you the way he should. He doesn't show the love and respect you deserve. You're carrying a huge burden for someone your age, and he should be the first to recognize that. You deserve more than this life, and he needs to understand that his choices have consequences. John took a deep breath, still hesitant, but something inside him was beginning to change. He knew Richard was right. As hard as it was to admit, his father was taking advantage of him and the system, and it needed to end. So, what should I do? John finally asked, looking up at Richard. Richard stood up again, went to a cabinet, and returned with an old, cracked cell phone. He handed it to John, holding it carefully. Here, this phone is old, but it works. It has a camera. Use it to record anything that confirms what you saw today. If you see him walking or doing something he shouldn't be able to do, record it. After that, we'll think about the next step. John took the phone with trembling hands, looking at it like it was a strange object. And if he notices, what if he catches me recording? Be careful, John. Do it in a way that he won't see. It's not for confronting him yet. This is just to make sure of what's going on, Richard explained encouragingly. John nodded slowly, tucking the phone into his pocket. Okay, I'll try, but Mr. Richard, thank you for listening to me, for helping me. You don't need to thank me, kid, Richard said, putting a hand on John's shoulder once more. You're strong, John, stronger than you think, and I'm here for anything you need. John stood up with a silent determination in his gaze. He knew that what lay ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he needed to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He waved goodbye to Richard and left the house, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a new spark of courage beginning to burn within him. John arrived home that evening with cautious steps. After what he had witnessed earlier, he felt even more tense entering. He opened the door carefully and saw his father in the living room, sitting in the wheelchair, just as he always did. David's expression was the same, cold, without a trace of affection. John placed the bags on the kitchen table and began preparing sandwiches with the bread he had bought at the bakery. "Dad, I bought bread, ham, and cheese. I'm making sandwiches for both of us," John said, opening the packages. He didn't expect a response, but tried to start a conversation. David remained silent for a few moments before murmuring without looking at him, "All this work for so little. You don't need to do it for me." "It's no trouble," John replied, trying to hide the hurt in his voice. "I like doing it." David continued staring at the off television as if it were more interesting than anything John said. "Do whatever you want," he replied curtly. John finished making the sandwiches and placed them on the table. He sat across from his father and started eating in silence, feeling the weight of the atmosphere. After a few minutes, he extended a plate with a sandwich to David. "Here, Dad. It's fresh," he said with a shy smile. David took the plate without enthusiasm, murmuring a brief thanks that sounded more like a formality than gratitude. They ate in silence, and John felt more alone than ever, even in his father's presence. After dinner, John washed the dishes, while David returned to the wheelchair and went to his room, as he always did. "Good night, Dad," John said, but David didn't respond. John sighed, finished washing the dishes, took a quick shower, and went to bed. The next morning, John woke up early as usual. The routine was always the same. He dressed, had a simple coffee, and organized his things for another day of work. Before leaving, he passed by his father, who was in the living room in the wheelchair, staring out the window. "I'm going to work, Dad. See you later," John said. David responded with a brief wave without even glancing at him. John opened the door and left, but he had a plan in mind. A few minutes later, he returned home, this time opening the door as carefully as possible to avoid making any noise. Upon entering, he saw David standing again, this time holding a book in his hands, walking slowly across the room while reading. John hid, watching him for a few seconds. He thought his father probably used the moments when he was out to exercise his legs as much as possible. Carefully, John pulled out the old cell phone Richard had given him and took some pictures. Then he left as quietly as he had entered and went to his stand, as if nothing had happened. In the following days, John repeated the strategy. He would leave the house as usual, but return minutes later to catch his father walking or doing tasks that contradicted his condition. Each day, he recorded more evidence. David carrying things across the room, rummaging through drawers, and even stretching while standing. When he thought he had enough material, John decided it was time to act. On a seemingly normal morning, John left the house with the evidence on his phone and went straight to Richard's house. He knocked on the door, and the neighbor greeted him with his usual warm smile. "John, everything okay? Looks like you have something important to say," Richard said, noticing the serious expression on the boy's face. "I want to show you something," John said, entering the house. He took out the phone from his pocket and started showing the pictures he had taken over the past few days. "Mr. Richard, I did what you suggested. I waited, I recorded, and now I know. He's really pretending." Richard looked carefully at the pictures, nodding slowly. "You did a thorough job, John. This here is enough proof to show what's going on. But what do you want to do now?" John hesitated for a moment, lowering his eyes. His hand gripped the phone tightly, as if it was the only thing keeping him steady. He breathed deeply, trying to organize the words that fought to come out. "Mr. Richard, I want to report my dad," he said, finally. His voice trembled, but there was a quiet determination in it. "I know it's the right thing to do, but I'm scared." Richard leaned forward slightly, his expression serious and full of concern. "Scared of what, John? You can tell me." Everything," John replied, looking at the neighbor with eyes full of uncertainty. "I've never done anything like this before. I don't even know what to say. And after, what if he finds out it was me? What if he tries to do something to me?" The words came out quickly, as if John had been holding this weight for a long time. He continued, his voice full of emotions. "He's not an easy dad, you know that. I already feel alone with him. And if he hates me even more, or tries to hurt me..." Richard put his hand on John's shoulder, gently squeezing it. "John, listen, you know this is the right thing to do, right?" John nodded slowly, though the gesture was hesitant. "I do, but it doesn't make the fear go away." Richard sighed, looking at the boy with a mixture of pride and sympathy. "John, what you're feeling is normal. It's hard to face a situation like this, especially with someone so close. But I want you to know you're not alone. I'll go with you to the police station. I won't let you face this alone." "Really?" John asked, surprised, his eyes wide. "Of course," Richard replied firmly. "I'll explain everything with you. I'll make sure the authorities understand what's happening and that you stay safe. After that, we'll figure it out. I won't let your dad do anything to you." John bit his lip, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. "Thank you, Mr. Richard. I didn't know if I could do this alone." Richard smiled faintly and stood up. "You don't have to do it alone, John. Now let's handle this once and for all. Take the phone with the pictures and I'll go with you. Don't worry, I'll be with you the whole time." John nodded, still nervous, but feeling more confident seeing Richard's determination. He tucked the phone into his pocket, took a deep breath, and followed the neighbor down the street. The walk to the police station seemed longer than it was, and the emotional weight of what he was about to do made each step harder. When they reached the building, John paused for a moment at the door. "What if they don't believe me?" he said, looking at Richard with apprehension. "They will believe you, John. You have proof, and you're doing the right thing." "Let's go in," Richard said, encouraging the boy with a gentle nudge on his shoulder. They were greeted by a police officer at the counter who looked at them curiously. "Good morning, how can I help you?" he asked. Richard took the lead, speaking calmly but firmly. "We're here to make a report. It's about a government benefits fraud." The officer raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "Understood. Please follow me," he said, leading them to a small, dimly lit private room. They sat down in simple chairs while a second officer, an older man, entered with a notepad. "Okay, you can start. What's going on?" the officer asked, looking at John. John swallowed hard, exchanging a glance with Richard before speaking. "It's about my dad. He's pretending he can't walk. He's been using a wheelchair for years and says he became paralyzed after an accident, but he can walk. I saw him, and I have proof." The officer leaned forward, interested. "Proof? What kind of proof, kid?" John pulled out the phone from his pocket and handed it to the officer. "I took these pictures over the past few days. Whenever he thinks I'm not home, he gets up, walks around the room, moves things. But when I'm around, he pretends he can't leave the chair." The officer began to look through the photos on the phone, examining each one carefully. He looked at Richard and asked, "Do you confirm this story?" "Yes, sir," Richard said. "I'm John's neighbor, and I've been watching the situation closely. This kid has been supporting the household almost entirely by himself, selling lemonade on the street, while his father takes advantage of a benefit he clearly shouldn't be receiving. It's an unjust situation, and John deserves a chance to live without this burden." The officer nodded slowly, still reviewing the photos. "This is a very serious accusation, but the evidence is convincing. We'll open an investigation. The boy's father will be notified, and medical exams will be done to confirm whether he is really able to walk." John felt his heart race. He knew he was doing the right thing, but the idea of David finding out what he had done terrified him. What if he finds out it was me? He'll know, won't he? I'm scared of what he might do. The officer looked up at John, his face now more serious. That's a legitimate fear, kid. We'll take steps to ensure your safety. Do you have a place to stay in case you need to leave home? The officer asked, watching John carefully. John hesitated, nervously fidgeting with his hands. No, I live with him. I don't have anywhere else to go. Richard, who had been standing beside him, immediately put his hand on the boy's shoulder. He can stay with me, Richard said firmly. Since this all started, I've seen how much he suffers at that house. I have the space, and I can take care of him. The officer looked at Richard and made a note on his notepad. That solves part of the problem, but we need to formalize this with a protective order. We'll ask the judge to issue a restraining order against his father, prohibiting him from coming near the boy while the process is ongoing. John looked up, surprised and relieved. So, he won't be able to come near me? Exactly, the officer replied. If the order is issued and he violates it, he can be arrested immediately. Our priority is to ensure you stay safe while the case is investigated. Richard nodded and gently squeezed John's shoulder. Don't worry, kid. You won't have to face this alone anymore. Thank you, John said, his voice still trembling, but filled with gratitude. I didn't know what to do. I thought no one would believe me. You did the right thing, John, the officer said, looking at him seriously. It's not always easy, especially when it involves someone so close, but the truth needs to come to light. After a few hours of finalizing the report and providing the necessary details, John and Richard left the police station. Night had already fallen, and the walk back to Richard's house was quiet, though the emotional weight of the day still lingered. Now you're going to pack your things and come stay with me, Richard said as he opened the door. I don't want you spending another night in that house until we sort this out. John looked at his neighbor, emotional. Are you sure? I don't want to be a bother. Bother? Richard laughed, trying to lighten the mood. John, you could never bother me. I should have offered this earlier. Let's go get your stuff. I'm with you. The next morning, John went back to his house with Richard to get his clothes and belongings. David was there, sitting in the wheelchair, and looked at his son with the same cold look as always. Where were you yesterday? David asked, emotionless. John hesitated, but Richard intervened firmly. He was with me. John's going to stay at my house for a while. He needs a quieter place now. David frowned, clearly irritated, but said nothing. John nervously gathered his things quickly and left with Richard, feeling relieved as he passed through the door for the last time. The following days were full of tension. David was officially notified of the report and summoned to explain himself. Initially, he denied everything vehemently, but the evidence was undeniable. John's photos, combined with the medical exams conducted during the investigation, showed that David was fully capable of walking. The case moved forward quickly, and he was formally charged with fraud against the system. Meanwhile, John began to adjust to life at Richard's house. The neighbor made sure to create a welcoming environment, preparing meals together, helping John with the lemonade stand, and showing him that he was no longer alone. For the first time in years, John felt the warmth of a real home. You know, John, Richard said one night as they ate dinner, you're very brave. Not everyone would have the strength to do what you did. I don't feel that brave, John replied, stirring his food. But for the first time, I feel like I did the right thing. You did, Richard said with a smile, and I'm here to make sure you never have to go through that again. When the verdict was finally handed down, David was ordered to repay the money he had improperly received and serve time for fraud. He tried to argue that the photos had been fabricated, but the medical exams confirmed the ruse. Additionally, the restraining order against John was upheld, ensuring that David could not come near the boy. With the case over, John could focus on starting over. He continued living with Richard, who had become not just a guardian, but the father figure John had always needed. Together, they began building a new life, full of possibilities and finally, peace. "You have a bright future ahead of you, John," Richard said one day as they adjusted the new lemonade stand. "And I'll be here to help you achieve everything you want." "Thank you, Mr. Richard," John replied with a sincere smile. "For everything. I never would have made it alone." John knew that, despite the struggles of the past, he now had a real chance to be happy. And with Richard by his side, he felt that nothing was impossible. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.